So today we're on part 1 of Psychological Disorders, chapter 16, also known as Abnormal Psychology, from the David Myers 8th edition psychology textbook. So we're going to look at psychological disorders. We're going to look at the abnormal. And so here's, remember, just a preview of everything that we're going to go over. You need to know the different categories. You need to know like neurotransmitters that cause these kind of disorders. And the last thing that you really got to know is chapter 17, which is the therapies on how to actually correct these orders. So this is just a statement by someone who has obsessive compulsive disorder. So I felt the need to clean my room, spent 4 to 5 hours at it. At the time I loved it, but then didn't want to do it anymore, but could not stop. The clothes hung 2 fingers apart. I touched my bedroom wall before leaving the house. I had constant anxiety. I thought I might be nuts. This is what you're talking about when you look at someone who has like OCD or any abnormal disorder. They can't control it, and they need help. And so this Mark, the OCD patient, he's sought help, and there's ways to actually treat these kind of disorders. So when you look at a psychological disorder, what we're looking at is it being caused, or the fascination is kind of being caused by maybe 2 reasons. I mean, people really love abnormal psychology. During different times in our lives, we feel, act, and think like an abnormal individual. So when we're going through this unit, a lot of people believe that they are actually abnormal and that there's something psychologically wrong with them. It's probably not. It's that we all have tendencies towards the abnormal. So psychological disorders may bring unexplained physical symptoms, irrational fears, and suicidal thoughts. We also see this with people, you know, like we're just fascinated by this kind of stuff. And so this is why psychological disorders is pretty well covered in the media, and people study it a lot. So to study the abnormal, we really kind of need to understand the normal. So there are 450 million people who suffer from psychological disorders. Depression is the most common of psychological disorders. Most people will experience depression. It's like the common cold. And schizophrenia is really rare, but it is common, and it does exist in all cultures of the world. So depression and schizophrenia exist everywhere that we've looked. Now when we look at defining the psychological disorders, you need to look at the 3 Ds. You know, look at deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional behavior. And deviant behavior means it deviates from the normal. It's not what normal people do. Distressful, it causes some sort of stress, anxiety, some sort of pressure on the person's life. And dysfunctional, what dysfunctional means is it stops a person from living a normal life. So if a behavior is deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional, therefore it would be an abnormal behavior, and it would be defined as a psychological disorder. So whenever the AP exam is asking you, like they might give you an essay question, and it might be like on an abnormal disorder, you need to look at how the behavior or how the scenario that they give you matches these 3 Ds: deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional. Now, deviant behavior, like going naked, in one's culture may be actually normal, but it might not be normal like in the Western culture. In the Western culture, you're going to get arrested. Deviant behavior may also have some distress accompanying it. And then if a behavior is actually dysfunctional, then it's clearly a disorder. If it prevents you from living a normal life, then we consider it dysfunctional. When we look at the old ways of treating things, they would do, like where they would go ahead and you see they would actually bore holes into someone's skull here. They would do exorcism. They would beat somebody. They would freeze them, like put them in ice cold water. They would even put animal blood in a human being. Pinel, he comes up with this medical model, and the medical model says that it's not really about you being possessed by a demon or an evil spirit, but it's really that there's something wrong with your mind. There's a madness that is according to your mind. There's something wrong with your mind. And so when we look at this medical model, what we try and look at is we try and look at the cause and the development of an actual disorder. We try and diagnose it. So we want to look at the symptoms. We want to treat it. And then we want to give some prognosis, some forecast about what the future of this disorder is going to be. So remember, we look at the biopsychosocial perspective and everything. So there's biological reasons for disorders. Normally it can be like brain chemistry when we look at like our neurotransmitters. It could be a genetic part. It could be evolution as well. Psychological, the environment could be doing stuff like stress on a person, trauma, learned helplessness, and it could be mood-related things. Social, cultural influences, there's roles, and there's expectations for people that we have, and then there's these definitions of what we think is normal. So when we classify someone's psychological disorder, what we do is we look at the DSM-4. That's the most current manual on how to actually diagnose a person's psychological disorder. There are 400 psychological disorders compared to 60 in the 1950s. So as time has gone on, we've actually learned a little bit more about the brain and how people operate. So we've been able to diagnose more psychological disorders. It doesn't suggest that we're actually getting more crazy. It just suggests that we're getting better at pinpointing why people are the way they are. So here's just the axes to the actual DSM-4. So clinical syndrome, cognitive anxiety, mood disorder present, personality disorder, our mentally retardation is going to be here as well. So people with the low IQ, it will be in the DSM. You know, a lot of stuff is in the DSM. So like when you look at that axis 3, the general medical conditions like diabetes, hypertension, arthritis, these are things that can also be in the DSM because the DSM contains anything that is abnormal, which most people don't have. It's in there. Is it psychosocial, or is there environmental presence in there? So like, do you have school, housing issues, and then global assessment, you know, how is the person actually functioning? So when you look at this axis 1, here's just some things that axis 1 looks at. And here's things axis 2, 3, 4, and 5 look at. So the goals of the DSM: describe the disorders and determine how prevalent the disorder is. If you go into a psychologist or a psychiatrist and everybody's coming out schizophrenic with every single one of their diagnoses, that doesn't seem right because only 1 to 2% of the population is actually diagnosed with schizophrenia. So if, you know, all 100 patients come in and they all have schizophrenia, it might be the psychologist or the psychiatrist who doesn't actually do the job right. So the DSM tries to prevent errors in diagnosing. So this is what it does. That's why it is considered reliable. Other critics, you know, they do criticize the DSM for putting any kind of behavior within the compass of psychiatry. So some people don't like psychology, they don't like psychiatry, and so they just criticize it. When we look at labeling psychological disorders, we can get some issues. You know, you do have critics of labeling because labeling might actually stigmatize a person. People might believe someone's crazy because of it. Labels can be helpful though, and they can be helpful because now you kind of know how to maybe adapt to the person or communicate with the person. Things like insanity though, those kind of labels, it raises sometimes moral and ethical questions about like how should you treat somebody. So Ted Kaczynski here, he's the guy that's the Unabomber, and so like how do you treat him? You know, he's sick. He's an antisocial personality disorder, so how do you treat him? And those are the kind of issues that we look at. The first category that we're going to look at is this thing called anxiety disorders. And anxiety disorders are where you have feelings of excessive apprehension and anxiety. And here are the 4 that we look at. We look at generalized anxiety disorder, also known as GAD. We look at phobias, panic disorders, and obsessive compulsive disorders, also known as OCD. So generalized anxiety disorder, the symptoms are persistent, they're uncontrollable tenseness and apprehension. It's generalized, they cannot tell you why they're afraid, they just know that they have anxiety about everything. And it's automatically aroused. It's the autonomic arousal is all over. They're just always tense and built up. They can't pinpoint what causes their problem, so there's no way for them to actually avoid it. When you look at panic disorder, this is also something that we look at. Panic disorders are normally like panic attacks, and these are minute-long episodes of intense dread that can be followed by like feelings of terror, chest pain, choking, or any other frightening sensation that occurs for a person. Anxiety is a component of both disorders, so panic disorders and our generalized anxiety disorder, and it occurs in people, and they just really can't avoid these situations that cause it, and sometimes they don't know what causes their panic attack. It could just be one thing that will cause it. Phobias are very specific. Phobias are an irrational fear of a specific object or situations. So these are just common phobias, like when you survey people, like people are scared of snakes, bears, you know, those kind of things. So here's just common phobias. A phobia you can avoid, whereas like generalized anxiety disorder or panic disorder, you can't really avoid it because you're not always certain what's going to cause it. So with a phobia, I know I'm scared of snakes and bears, so I don't go in the woods because I don't want to be eaten or bitten by a snake. So kinds of phobias, here's just like agoraphobia, the phobia of open places, you know, here's just different phobias. Now you notice they're all Greek. Now, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, this is the persistence of unwanted thoughts, obsessions. Like you're thinking about something, you can't stop thinking about it, and that urges you to engage in some sort of ritual, some compulsion that will actually cause you to de-stress. So an OCD patient suffers from an anxiety disorder. So they have these obsessions, these thoughts that they cannot stop themselves from having, and what they do is they need to do some sort of ritual to actually stop that thought. A lot of people who are OCD, they do have a concern with dirt or germs or toxins. So you're looking at about 40% of the population that actually kind of has that. And out of that population, what you see is about 85% of them do some sort of excessive hand washing, bathing, toothbrushing, or grooming. You do have people who have OCD who are constantly afraid of what's going to end up happening, like what's going to happen in the near future. And then you have, like, you know, the checking the doors and the locks and everything. When you look at brain imaging, a PET scan of the brain, which remember PET scans are radioactive glucose, what it does is it shows us that they have high metabolic activity in their frontal lobe areas, which may be driving their attention. It may be directing their attention to stuff that other people really don't pay attention to. So it's almost like they're so attentive to things, they just can't shut it off. So instead of having like hyperactivity disorder, these people are just like actively engaged and can't stop concentrating on whatever it is that they're obsessed with. So post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is another thing that we look at with an anxiety disorder. This is 4 or more weeks of the following symptoms, which would mean that you have PTSD. They have haunting memories, and the memories are like reoccurring. They have nightmares, which is they can't go to sleep, or sometimes they're afraid to sleep, which is only going to cause more sleeping problems. They have a lot of social withdrawal, and they're socially withdrawn because they're afraid that people are going to think of them different. They're afraid of those memories, of the anxiety that causes the being around a lot of people. Not everybody has PTSD just because they've been in a post-traumatic stress situation. Like just because you were in a hurricane or just because you were in war, it doesn't mean that you have PTSD. PTSD needs 4 or more weeks for it to actually be diagnosed, and so it needs to be something that it can happen just with a sound or with a smell or just with the image of something that is familiar to them. Only about 10% of women and 20% of men react to traumatic situations and actually develop PTSD. When you look at the Holocaust, the concentration camps, most of those people were pretty resilient and they didn't even have PTSD. So what we do know when we're like looking at religions is that when you look at religions around the world, most religions say that when you suffer some sort of trauma, it actually leads to the growth of an individual. When we explain anxiety disorders, Freud said that we're trying to repress our memories. Remember, that's one of his defense mechanisms is repression. So he said we repress these things, and this is actually what causes our anxiety. Now, with the learning perspective, what some people do with anxiety disorders is they do this thing called fear conditioning. And this is when you try, like if you're scared of heights, you might have somebody go up slowly and start conditioning themselves to not be scared of the event anymore. And what it does is it forces the person to be reconditioned or reinforced in a different way. Another thing that they do is they do like observational learning. So observational learning, like the young monkeys, they did this experiment where they developed a fear when they watched other monkeys who were afraid of snakes. So sometimes what we're afraid of is because we've observed it. You know, I'm scared of snakes because I just think that they're going to bite you and kill you, because every time I see a snake in a movie, it's not like a pet-friendly snake. It's the killer, let's snakes on a plane kind of snake. So the biological perspective, natural selection, has led to our ancestors learning to be afraid of snakes. The ancestors that survived were the ones who got to pass down their DNA. So the ones who were scared of snakes and didn't try and eat lion dinners, those were the ones who lived. So that's why we are scared of snakes and lions. We're scared of spiders and any other animal that could possibly prevent us from actually continuing our species, preventing us from actually reproducing. So twin studies suggest that our genes may be partly responsible for developing fears and anxieties, and twins normally share the same phobias. My sister and I were both scared of snakes, and we're both scared of clowns, and it's just who we are. When we look at the biological perspective, we do see that there's something different with their brain. The anterior cingulate cortex, this is different in their brains than it is in another brain. And we're going to stop here, and I'm going to go with part 2 for the dissociative